Okay, so let's talk about some of these different shooting modes and what everything kind of means here. Want to go down the line here. First is the shutter. The shutter is how fast. How fast you're going to capture an image. Okay. Um, the lower the shutter speed, the more blur you get. The higher the shutter speed, the more you freeze action. So if you're into doing a lot of sports, things like that, you can use faster shutter speeds if you want to stop the action. Now, again, in shooting sports, if you want to get a little bit of what's called motion blur or blur, which denotes action, you can shoot it at a slower shutter speed. So it really kind of depends on what you want to do. I'm going to be showing you guys some examples of the difference between a faster shutter speed and a slower shutter speed. Okay, so shutter is how fast. Okay, aperture is how much light you're letting into the camera. Okay, um, the aperture on a camera, the wider the aperture, and this is something that actually took me a little bit of time to wrap my head around when I was first starting, and I don't know why. And come to think of it, I don't know exactly why camera people who came up with this stuff decided that it was going to work this way. The larger the aperture, the lower the aperture number. So if you have a lens that goes down to f2.8, you're going to have a very large aperture. Okay. If you set your camera to f22, your aperture is going to be very small. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Think of an aperture working the same way your eye does, or your iris does. Okay, when you get in lower light, the iris on your eye opens up to try to let more light in. Okay, when you go out in the sun, if you're not wearing sunglasses, your iris closes down to let in less light. Okay, aperture works exactly the same way. Okay, you're in a darker area, you want to let more light in, you open up the aperture. You're in a lighter area, you want to let less light in, you close down the aperture. Now, these are basic rules. And once you get a handle on the basic rules, then you can start learning how to break those rules. And that's where you start kind of getting into the artistry of photography, because then you can start using these things in combination with each other to achieve a lot of different looks, styles, so on and so forth. Okay, so again, shutter, how fast, aperture, how much. Okay, third one is ISO. And I know this is a big, huge deal for a lot of people, myself included, when I first started learning this. And I I tried going with the exposure triangle. And for me, in the way my brain kind of works, I could never wrap my head around the exposure triangle. Um, so I got a slightly different way of hopefully explaining it to you guys, so it'll make it pretty clear. Um, aperture and shutter, like ISO, are just different methods of controlling your exposure. Okay, with ISO is a little bit different because basically, excuse me, I'm sorry. ISO is basically how much plus how fast. Okay, how much light that it's going to get to that sensor and how fast is it going to get that light there. Okay, so if you go back into the old film days, I don't know if anybody's ever shot film. ISO used to be called ASA, and basically ASA was film speed. So you had film speed anywhere from 25 up to, you could probably find it 1,000 or 2,000, which would be the equivalent of ISO 25 to ISO 2000. Okay, same numbering system, they changed the lettering, don't know why. Now, in the old days and on film, when you used a faster film, say you used 1,000 speed film, again, which would be the equivalent to 1,000 ISO, the film would come back grainy. Okay, there'd be a grain to the film. Now, with the digital processors and the digital capture devices that are in these cameras, ISO equals noise. When we were using film, we would use grain as a look. We can't do the same with ISO. ISO doesn't give you a look, it gives you grain, or it gives you noise. Okay, it's an electronic digital chip, and what it does is it adds gain. As you increase your ISO, it adds more gain. So you're basically, what's happening is you're getting a lot more light faster into the camera. Okay, so depending on how your shutter speed is set, depending on how your aperture is set, is going to be dependent on how your ISO is going to be set. Now, I've seen people use higher ISOs outdoors because, again, they wanted to achieve kind of a certain look. So again, the idea here is to really get your head around how this whole exposure thing works, and then you can start experimenting with it, breaking the rules a little bit. And we're going to get into each of these a little bit as we go along here, but I know this is going to be a big part of the discussion. So one more time, shutter, how fast do you want that shutter to open and close? Aperture, how much light do you want in? And ISO, how much light do you want in, and how fast do you want it to hit that that processor or that capture device? Okay, so now we're going to work on kind of separating them out here. Okay, so and the way I want to do that is I want to explain this through shooting modes, and it's going to kind of help to understand the first two parts of that, the aperture and the shutter speed. Okay, again, I don't talk about auto because the idea here is to get you guys out of auto. Even if you're using program mode, you're one step closer to really being able to control your camera. One of the things I've told students in the past is that's the idea of having a camera. When you pay a lot of money for a camera, I think the misconception is that people figure if they've got a better camera, they're going to take better pictures. That's not true. It's the person holding that camera that's going to take the better pictures. Understanding this stuff is really going to help you in that respect. I don't remember the last time I actually had my camera in auto, or program for that matter. But program is a good place to start. Again, it's a way to kind of teach yourself. It allows you to analyze your pictures. If you get them into Lightroom or something like that, you can see the metadata of the camera, and it'll tell you your shutter speed, it'll tell you your aperture, it'll tell you your ISO settings, it'll tell you if your flash fired, so on and so forth. So there's metadata built into the pictures that you can take and kind of analyze. So if you start off in auto mode, you can kind of look at how your aperture and your shutter speed are set, sort of reverse engineer that. Then you can make the step to program mode. So basically what program mode does is it will set your shutter speed and your aperture for you. It's kind of like auto. Um, Here's the thing about auto as well. When you shoot in auto, your camera does all the thinking for you, from focus to metering, aperture, shutter, ISO, and then what your camera also does, because basically it's a computer, is it's going to take that picture and it's going to process it. It's going to add a little bit of contrast, it's going to add maybe a little bit of saturation, so on and so forth. So it's going to pre-process that picture. Okay. Again, my advice, as you're moving a little bit more into the, as you're moving into the professional realm of things, you want to be in control of that. So this is why I really stress getting out of auto when it comes to this stuff. Okay. So program mode will set your shutter speed and set your aperture settings for best exposure. So it does a little bit of the thinking for you. Okay. The nice thing about program mode is, say you're shooting outside, and you take a shot and you look at it and you see that it was shot at 250th of a second at 5.6. Okay. If you say you want to get a little bit more, like we talked about, slow down the shutter speed and get a little bit more blur to see a little bit more action in your shot, if you take and you drop your shutter speed, say down to a 60th of a second, in program mode, it will set your aperture correctly for that shutter speed. By the same token, if you want to get, say, more depth of field, you could set your aperture, say you're at 5.6 and your camera or your lens is capable of going to 2.8. You can dial your f-stop down to 2.8 and your shutter speed will adjust accordingly. So you have a little bit of flexibility with program mode in that respect. Okay, again, camera does most of the thinking for you, but again, it's a good way to get in there and start experimenting to see how different aperture settings or different shutter speed settings are going to affect your shot and how they're going to affect each other. Okay. The next mode is shutter priority. Okay. And basically shutter priority is that you set how fast the shutter is going to open and close. So you set the shutter speed and your camera is going to determine the aperture setting for that, the best aperture setting for that. Okay, so again, you're shooting sports and you want to shoot at 500th of a second. You take your shutter speed, you move it to 500th of a second. Your camera is going to go ahead and it will set the aperture for you. So if it's a bright sunny day, it might set it down to f11, f14, something like that. Okay, so that's shutter priority. Shutter priority is going to allow you, again, how fast that shutter is going to open and close. If you are shooting a river and you want to blur the stream as it passes by, you want to take your shutter, you want to drop it down to 60th of a second to kind of get a little bit of blur, make that water kind of look soft. Again, you set your shutter to the appropriate shutter speed. Your camera is going to set the aperture for you. Okay?
Oh, pretty good.
Now, the next one is aperture priority. And if you remember when I showed you the top dials on the camera, we're looking at P, S, and A on Nikon, and P TV, and now AV on a Canon. Okay, so we're in AV on Canon and A on a Nikon. And I believe Sony, I don't know, I know there's a few people that are using Sonys out there. And I'm sorry. I think Sony has the same settings as Nikon. Now, aperture priority, basically what that is you set the aperture, your camera sets the shutter speed for you. Okay, so if you're doing macro photography and you're shooting a flower and you want the flower to be in focus, but maybe the leaves and the green behind it to be out of focus, you're going to set a wider aperture. So you might set your aperture at 3.5, 2.8, something like that, and then your camera will set the shutter speed appropriately based on that aperture. Okay, again, if you're shooting a mountain range, if you're doing scenic photography, you want a longer depth of field, so you need to close that aperture down. And again, you set it at f/22, and then the camera again will set your appropriate shutter speed for you. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Okay. And then manual, that gives you full control. You set your aperture, you set your shutter speed, and you do your best to try to figure out based on what you're shooting. If you're shooting portraits, you average is probably maybe f4, f5.6, shooting it at maybe a 60th, 80th of a second, 125th of a second. So if you use these other modes to kind of get an idea as to what your camera is doing, that's going to lead you eventually to being able to control everything using manual. Okay, I would have to say 99.9% of the time I shoot in manual. Partly because I like the flexibility, partly because I'm a control freak. So, yes, autofocus, yeah, absolutely. Autofocus is keep that separate from exposure. Any of the exposure setting, which is any of the things that you're seeing on the screen right now, you can either do autofocus or manual focus. That's a function of the lens, not a function of the exposure modes. Okay. Now, standard shutter on a camera, and I'm going to kind of go through some of this stuff a little bit quicker here. And I'm starting at 1/15th of a second, but if you notice on here, it goes 1/15th, 1/30th, 1/60th, 1/25th, so forth. Now, the steps between each of these is one stop, one full stop. Okay, so 1/15th to 1/30th is one stop. 1/30th to 1/60th is one stop. Here's the weird one. For some reason, 1/60th to 1/25th is, in fact, one stop, even though the math doesn't work out. And then you'll see it goes back to doubling every time. Okay, so you can see one stop, one stop, one stop, all the way up. Okay, so if you can do the math from wherever your setting is, that's basically what you're looking at. Okay, now on most digital cameras, you can work in third stops. Okay, so 1/15th to 1/20th is a third, 1/20th to 1/25th is a third, and then 1/30th is your full stop. Okay, and that goes right up the line. So you can work in thirds on most digital cameras or digital SLRs. Okay. Now, here's a shot that I took at 1/5 of a second, and it's of a waterfall. And you can see how the water looks like it's just a sheet, kind of a white sheet. You can see I shot this at 1/5 of a second, so pretty slow shutter speed. I did shoot this on a tripod because it was such a slow shutter speed. But you can see what it does to the water. That shutter stays open longer, so anything that's moving is going to blur. So you get almost no detail in the water whatsoever. It just looks like white sheets cascading over the rocks. Now in this one, I shot this at 1/1600th of a second, and you can see that you can now notice a lot more detail in the water. You can get some of the water splashing off the rocks. It stops that motion pretty close to dead stop. You're not getting any blurring. You're getting a lot of detail. My exposure was a little low on this, so I apologize for that. But you can see a lot of little splashes and a lot of little details in there, as opposed to the one that was shot at 1/5 of a second. So again, the faster the shutter speed, the more it's going to stop your action. And now you can see them side by side. Okay, so you can see on the left I've got the 1/5, and on the right I've got the 1/1600th of a second. So you can see the difference between the two in the detail that you're getting. Okay. Now, aperture or f-stop, you're going to hear both. Keep in mind, shutter is a function of the camera. Okay, your shutter is built into your camera. Okay, aperture is built into your lens. So we talked about the difference between some of the different lenses that are out there, kit lens versus a faster lens. Again, f-stop is a function of your lens. Okay, so if you look on the far left here, I'm starting out at f2.8, and as I explained earlier, the lower the number, the larger the aperture. Now, the larger the aperture, the shallower the depth of field. And I'll be explaining that here in just a second here. So you can see it goes up 2.8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22 follows that. Again, like shutter speed, it goes up by a full stop. So from f2.8 to f.4 is full, one full stop, to 5, 6, one full stop, f8, one full stop, so on and so forth. Again, on digital cameras, you can do 1/3 stops as well. So again, you got f2.8, 1/3 up from that is f3.2, 1/3 up from that is f3.5, one full f4, and so forth. Okay, so you can also go up in 1/3 stops as well. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's talk about how f-stop works. Okay, again, shutter is how fast you're getting the light to sensor. Okay, your aperture is how much light's getting in there and what that's going to do. Okay, so we talked about an f2.8. Like I said, most kit lenses are going to start off at about 3.5. So that's stop and a half, stop and a third, I think. What happens with an f2.8 lens, and I mostly use lower f-stop lenses for things like portraiture, for things like macro photography, anything that you're going to do close up. You don't want to do a huge wide shot with an f2.8 aperture setting. But you can see what it does. It keeps, as you can see on the picture, it keeps her very well in focus, and it drops the background out of focus. Okay, so what's happening here is the wider the lens, the shorter your depth of field. Okay, so we've got a wide lens. She's in focus, but the background is out of focus. Now you have to be very careful when you get into these lower f-stop lenses. 2.8 is about average, but you can get faster lenses. You can get a 1.8, 1.4, 1.2. When you get those faster lenses, the one thing that happens is that depth of field gets even shorter. So you have to be very careful about how you focus, because her nose could be in focus and her ears could be out of focus. I mean, that's how short it can get. Okay, so you got to be real careful. So, like I said, a lower aperture number, larger aperture equals shorter distance and shorter depth of field. Okay, now when you get into even wider lenses or faster lenses, as you can see here, I've got an f2.8, and you can kind of see the background on her. It's pretty much out of focus. Things are kind of circular back there. Okay, they're not quite as blurred, but you know, they're kind of getting there. Now, if you look at the picture on the right, that's an f.2, and you'll notice if you look, the circular shapes in the background are now a little even more soft. I'm starting to drop off focus where it hits her ear and her earring. So again, I'm going with a wider, and that's a full stop difference right there. So my aperture is wider, so therefore my depth of field shrinks even more. So I've got a very shallow depth of field using an f1.2 lens. That particular, when you get into those lower numbered lenses, f1.8, f1.2, you get what's called a bokeh effect, and it means blur or haze. It's a Japanese word. So you're getting a little bit more of a, I guess, a creamier look in the background, the lower f-stop that you go. Okay. So again, I'm going to show you this a little bit more on the close-up side here. So at f2.8, you can see a little bit more details in the circles. If you look to the left side of the shot, you'll see a little bit more of a detailed circle there. If I go to the 1.2, you can see how that circle is kind of blurred. Her eyes are even slightly out of focus, even though her nose and her mouth are in focus, because her eyes are set a little bit further back, and that focuses, or that depth of field is a little bit narrower. Again, you have to be very, very careful on how you focus. If you're doing portraits and you focus, always focus on the eyes. Use the eyes as your focal point. And make sure that if your eyes are in focus, everything else should be pretty well in focus. But the eyes really, to get impact and everything, those eyes need to be sharp. Okay. Now, if you're doing a lot of landscape photography, you want to use a smaller aperture. So in this case, f.16 or f16. That's going to give you a longer depth of field. Okay, so everything that's close to your camera and everything that's far away from your camera is all going to be in focus. So as you build, say, from 2.8 to f16, and again, this is where you start experimenting a little bit. You start with 2.8, you've got a very wide aperture, and then as you move up and close down your aperture, your depth of field gets longer and longer and longer. Okay, so again, if you're doing a lot of scenic photography, things like that, a smaller aperture is always going to give you the longest depth of field, and it's going to give you the most amount of that scene in focus. Okay, and again, these rules can all be broken. You know, if you're shooting trees with mountains in the background, you can use a wider aperture to make sure the trees are in focus, but the background's a little bit out of focus. You don't want to, in a scenic photography, you don't want to necessarily completely blow the background completely out of focus. You definitely want some detail back there. So you're not necessarily going to shoot a shot like this at even f4. You'd probably start at a minimum of maybe f11, and that'll give you a pretty decent depth of field. Okay. Now, a little bit more of an explanation of depth of field. Basically, I've got 3 cameras just sitting here, and you'll notice on the very top left, the very front camera is in focus. The rear 2 cameras are out of focus. Okay, shorter depth of field, or larger depth of, larger aperture, smaller number, so about f2.8 is going to give me that that first camera in focus. Now, keep in mind, I am focusing on that first camera. Okay, in the second shot on the right hand side, I'm focusing on the middle camera. So again, you can see that rear camera is out of focus, and the camera that's in front is now also out of focus, but the middle camera is in focus. Okay, so even though I'm using a shorter depth of field, where I focus is also going to make a difference as well. Okay, so in that second shot on the right hand side, I'm focusing on that center camera. Okay, the one on the bottom, I'm focusing on the very back camera. And you can see the focus starting to fall off on that middle camera. It's not really out of focus, but it's out of focus quite a bit. And then you look at the front camera and it's completely out of focus. Okay, so again, my focus, I set my focus on that rear camera. So now my front camera is the result of the effect of a short depth of field. Okay. Yes, for the question was, so for a group of people, you would want a smaller aperture that they all stay in focus. Yes. I work for United Airlines, and every week we do a graduation, and our classes are usually between 20 and 40 people. So when you're shooting a large group like that, I'm probably shooting at f8, f11, and then I focus. I split my if I have 3 rows, I split my focus to about the middle row, and then I should get pretty decent focus throughout the whole shot. If I don't feel that I am, I'll drop my aperture by maybe 1 more stop just to make sure. But usually about f11 on a 3-row group is pretty good, yeah. Okay. Okay, now metering. Okay, I've had a lot of people ask me questions about, oh, what type of a meter should I buy, so on and so forth. Your camera has a pretty good meter, light meter in it. Again, in the old days, we pretty much had to have a separate light meter to meter things. Cameras have gotten pretty sophisticated, and they've built the meters into the cameras, and they're pretty good meters. You've got different types of meters, like you have, or different types of metering modes, like you have focusing modes, like we talked about earlier. So I'll give you an idea of what to look for in metering. The next thing is exposure. That's the big secret one. That's ISO. And then we're going to touch on a little bit of composition and lighting real quick. So here we go. Okay, so you've got a couple different types of metering within your camera. You've got what's called matrix metering, and again, you might want to go ahead and refer to your manuals to find out the correct terminology for your specific camera. And basically, matrix metering is good for just kind of overall metering for general shooting. If you're shooting the family party or even a wedding, when you get to the point where you're shooting the candids at the reception, overall or a matrix metering is going to probably be your best friend, because it's going to give you good even light across your shot. Okay. Center weighted metering, as it says, the greatest weight is assigned to the center of the frame. So if you're doing macro photography, if you're doing portrait work, center weighted metering is a good way to kind of get a real good exposure in the center of your frame. Okay. And then the last type of metering is spot metering. Okay. One of the things that I had mentioned when we talked about the focusing, you can get a single focus point, which will be the AFS, a autofocus single. It's going to give you a single focus point in your camera. The spot metering is going to take that single focus point, and it's going to meter based off of that. Okay, so they kind of work in conjunction with each other. Okay, so the meters, that's real good if you're. It's real good if you're going to use, again, for macro photography. It's really good, and for portrait work, spot metering is really good. Again, I do a lot of portrait work, so a lot of times my metering stays on spot metering, because I know that's going to give me the best balance of light on my subject. Okay, so again, refer back to your manual. That'll give you a little bit more detail on the different terminology and a little bit better of an explanation on the different types of metering that your camera has in it. Okay, now the third exposure. Okay, again, I mentioned the exposure triangle, which is aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Again, for me, it was a little bit confusing to kind of learn that way, and it did take me a little bit of time to wrap my head around things. So hopefully I can explain it to you guys in a way that's really going to help as far as understanding how the three work together. Okay. So as I explained before, ISO is equal to film speed. Okay. Again, as I explained before, with film you had grain, with digital you have noise. So you have to be very careful between the two. And then, just what are the best settings and how they work? Well, there's really no best settings. Again, it's going to depend on what your situation is. And then the biggest is how they work with shutter speed and aperture. Okay. Again, ISO works the same way as shutter speed and aperture. So each setting in your camera that you see, on most cameras, the base setting or the default setting is 100 ISO. From there, it goes in one-stop increments: 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and however high your camera goes to. Different cameras now, they're getting more and more sensitive, so you're getting a lot more options for ISO, but again, you got to be very careful with this. Okay, and like shutter speed and aperture, ISO will also give you 1/3 stops. Okay, so there's two 1/3 stops in between each full stop. Okay, now these are 3 pictures that I took at 3 different ISO rates. Okay, and you can see that they're reasonably lit more or less the same. Okay, if you look at the one that's at ISO 100, I used a slower shutter speed. If you can see the snow in the lights, it's pretty blurred. Okay, the next one over, I bumped it up 3 stops, I'm sorry. So 100 to 200 is 1 stop, 200 to 400 is 2 stops, 400 to 800 is 3 stops. Okay, and you can see the snow is still kind of blurred, but you can see a little bit more detail, which basically, by bumping it up to ISO 800, I was able to also speed up my shutter so I could handhold my camera better. And then the last one, I went up one more step to 1600, and you could see there's, in the lights, again, you look at the snow, and I have a lot more detail. Again, I was able to increase my shutter speed by another stop by increasing my ISO by another stop. Okay, so when it comes to how all three work together, okay, and I'll give you a shooting scenario. Say you're shooting at a 60th of a second. Your aperture on your camera is wide open at f 3.5. Say you're using a kit lens. So your aperture is at 3.5. Your shutter is at a 60th of a second, but you're still getting underexposed by, say, 2 stops. Okay, so your pictures are dark. Okay, the option is you can decrease your shutter speed. The problem with that is you're already at a 60th of a second, so you don't want to go any lower than that, and you don't have a tripod with you. You can't adjust your aperture because it's open all the way. So the way you compensate for that is through ISO, okay, or a flash, but we're not talking flash here, okay. So you look at your camera, you say, okay, my aperture is at 3.5, my shutter speed's at 1/60th of a second, my ISO is now sitting at 100, okay. I'm probably, and again, this is something you get used to as you kind of go along. You say, okay, I'm probably short by 2 stops here. So I would take my ISO from 100 to 400. That's going to give me that extra 2 stops that I need without having to change my aperture, without having to change my shutter speed, so I'm still able to handhold my shot, but it's going to allow more light in faster to your sensor. Okay, so I'll say that again. When you increase your ISO, it lets more light in faster. So that way, you don't have to change your aperture because your aperture is maxed out. You don't have to change your shutter speed because your shutter speed is as low as it can get, and still you're still able to handhold your camera. So what do? I compensate by using ISO. Okay, so it works with the 3, or works as part of the 3 in certain situations. Okay, you can set an average ISO of 2 to 400 on your camera, and you can kind of do sort of general shooting indoors, outdoors, and not worry about it too much. But it's when you get into these critical situations is where you want to start working with ISO. And again, the reason that you want to be a little bit more cautious with ISO is because it has 2 steps of noise. Okay, and again, it depends on your camera. And what you might want to do, depending on the camera that you have, is go look at reviews on your camera. Usually a review on your camera will tell you where your camera is going to start maxing out at ISO to when it hits a noise ceiling. You have 2 kinds of two kinds of noise when it comes to your ISO. And you can experiment with this a little bit. Take a shot at higher ISO, say ISO 800. And if you zoom in real close, you'll start seeing noise, but you'll start seeing it in the blacks and the whites and the grays. Okay, that's called luma noise. Okay, luma is black and white. Now, if you start pushing it 1600 and above, and again, you zoom into a portion of the picture, you're going to start seeing the noise in the color space, or it's called chroma noise. Okay, so again, depending on your camera, and depending on the quality of the shot you're going to get uh, with a higher ISO is going to depend on how much noise you're going to get. Now, I got a question. ISO will be helpful in low light sporting conditions. Yes, it can. Fortunately, say for instance, we can take football, baseball, anything that you would shoot at night. If you're fortunate enough to be in a stadium, most stadiums use mercury lights, and they're pretty bright. They're equivalent to daylight. So you may have to push it up to maybe 8, maybe 1600 in order to get a faster shutter speed to freeze the action. But fortunately, the lighting in there is pretty good, so you can probably compensate and still keep a good quality picture without really having to overdo it in ISO. Now, gymnastics indoors, you probably have to pump it up a little bit more in gymnastics. Now, here's kind of the thing too, guys. You know, if you take pictures at a gymnastics meet or football game or baseball game or miniature golf or whatever, the people that are going to pick apart noise are us, the photographers. We're going to look at a picture and we're going to go, oh, that's kind of noisy. I had to really push my ISO. The parents, they're just going to be in love with the picture. So kind of keep that in mind too. And, you know, as photographers, we want to be as perfect as possible and try to get the best result as possible. But the simple fact is, you know, unless you're in a real critical situation, and at some point, you may have to forgo ISO and use a flash, which is the other option. Okay. But using a flash kind of takes us away from really getting a full understanding of how everything works as far as the exposure part of this whole thing. So experiment with ISO, but keep in mind that, you know, if you're outside and it's a bright sunny day and your camera happens to be on 1600, one, you're going to blow everything out and it's going to look really horrible. The other thing is it's going to be, you know, it's going to be very noisy. And I'm not sure who viewer 21 is, but yeah, in most indoor sports, I've got a colleague at work. Her daughter plays volleyball, and they're not allowed flashes either. But their gyms are reasonably lit, so hopefully that will be the case in the gymnastics meets that you end up doing. So again, you might have to push your ISO a little bit. You'd probably get a really decent shot shooting at about 250th of a second. If you can shoot with a faster lens, that will help. You got to be real careful with focus on a faster lens. But then you can pump up your ISO. And again, depending on the camera that you have, look at the reviews and try to figure out what would be an acceptable level of noise in that kind of a condition. Because it is going to vary from camera to camera, and it's going to vary from the quality of camera. You know, an entry-level camera is not going to have as good of a color profile as, you know, like a D810 or a 5D Mark. What's the latest one? 3, 4, I think. So that's going to kind of help you decide where you need to be as well. And Elaine, yes, chroma is color and black and white is luma or luminance. Okay. So like I said, ISO should be, it's not an afterthought, but it's definitely a tool that you want to really be able to get used to and understand. So like your shutter speed and your aperture, it works in one-stop increments. On digital cameras, again, you can do it in third stops. Okay. Keeping your aperture and your shutter speed in mind is going to determine what you do with your ISO. I shoot a lot of portrait work, so my ISO is pretty consistently at 100. In certain circumstances, I may pump that up. I'm getting ready to do a shoot where I'll probably have to pump that up to 400 to 800 because it's going to be an environment that I really don't have control over the lighting. So again, use it as a third tool, a very important tool, but a third tool to your main two types of exposure. And again, keep in mind, it works in one-stop increments, just like your shutter speed, just like your aperture. So when you use your shutter speed and your aperture, and you decide that you need to change your ISO settings, think of everything in that same respect. Okay, if you move your shutter speed one stop faster, your aperture has to go one stop open if you want to keep the same exposure. If you move your aperture and your shutter speed by one stop and you're in a situation where you need to adjust your ISO, then you have to remember to move that by one stop plus or minus, depending on what your shooting situation is, to make sure that your exposure stays the same. And again, the one thing I encourage you guys to do is experiment with this stuff. Bring your photos into Lightroom or a program that will allow you to read the metadata in your shot, and it's going to give you your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO settings. Now, if you're shooting in auto, the camera again is going to determine your ISO settings as well. Okay. The other problem with shooting in auto, if you're in a reasonably low light situation, that flash is always going to pop up. And you kind of don't want that if you're going to avoid it. That's when you would switch over to program mode, because in program mode you can decide whether you want that flash to pop up or not. In auto, it's going to pop up automatically if the camera says there's not enough light in here. So then you'd shift over. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons I don't use autos, because I don't want my flash popping up. Plus the flash on your camera is just horrible. So I know this part's a little confusing, and I know it's probably going to bring up questions later on, and that's great. You know, like I said, you know, before, write me if you need a little bit more of an explanation on it, or if there's something you don't quite understand about it. But just keep in mind, it's a third part of that exposure process, and once you get the other two parts down, ISO is pretty easy to understand in what you're going to be doing with it, whether you're going to be needing to increase it or decrease it or whatever. Okay. And again, like I mentioned, ISO will work in 1/3 stops. So 100 to 200 is one stop, 125, 160, 1/3 stops, and on up the line. Okay. I know a lot of the cameras now, they have like high 1, high 2. I think you can get up to 56,000 whatever. I never go that high, so I don't know. I don't even know the numbers. I don't want to know the numbers. But there's actually some cameras out there, the high-end professional $5,000, $8,000 cameras, that will actually pretty well at those outrageous ISO settings. I have no use for them, so it doesn't really apply to me. And I don't think it would apply to most people unless you're doing serious sports photography, in which case you'll probably buy a $6,000 to $10,000 camera. Okay. Now, real quick, I'm going to just kind of touch on a few things here, and I'm sure you guys have probably heard a lot about this stuff when it comes to composition. The rule of thirds. Basically, you split your viewfinder, your shots into 1/3 increments, just as you see here. And to make things more interesting, you don't always want to put things dead center in your shot. You want to move them off just a little bit. If you look at some of these shots, for instance, like this one, macro shot, and I see some amazing macro shots from a lot of you guys. I wish I could do macro photography, but I'm just not very good at it, nor am I good at scenic photography, so I stay away from that. Leave that to the people who truly have a knack for that. But you can see, for instance, on this particular shot, where that intersects, it intersects right across the bee's eye. Okay, that's a good focal point because eyes usually draw colors, usually draw some shapes, usually draw to certain aspects of a photograph. Now, on this photograph, if you notice, most of it's kind of right side heavy. There's very little on the left side over here. There's some space there. The wings kind of dip into that just a touch, but you don't really notice it because you're looking at the eye. The eye is the main focus of this picture. And again, you want to usually try to put the main focus of a shot on an intersecting line. Okay, so in this case, the eye is on the intersecting line. Okay. Again, scenic shot. When you're doing mountain ranges and stuff like that, unless you have a specific thing in there that draws your eye, mountain ranges are going to be pretty spread out. In this case, we got an open field and we've got a tree there. And again, you can kind of see the tree is sitting on a pretty close to where the lines are crossing. Those intersecting lines, again, they kind of draw your attention to where that tree is and everything like that. So again, keeping those things in mind are going to be the difference in a picture being interesting as opposed to dead center and people just kind of going, eh. The idea is to keep people looking at your pictures for as long as you can. Okay. Again, portrait shot. You can see again she's not dead center. Her eye is pretty close to the intersecting line, so it draws your eye to where she's at. Makes it a little bit more interesting because again there's some space on the left hand side, and generally in portrait work you're going to shoot most single people portraits. You're going to shoot those vertical. This one was shot horizontal, but again, you know, once you kind of get the idea, then you can start breaking the rules a little bit and making things a little bit more interesting. Okay. Now, I get a lot of questions about lighting as well. The diagram that I have here is pretty basic lighting setup. It's, you'll hear the expression or what it's known as is 3-point lighting. Okay, so in the center I have my subject. On the left side I've got my key light. Now your key light is your main light if you're going to do 3-point lighting, and in this case it doesn't matter if it's studio strobes or I know a lot of people use continuous lighting. Okay, so you pretty much want to set it up the same way. So your key light is going to be your main light. It's going to light the majority of your subject. Okay, your fill light is usually 1.5 times the distance of your key light. Okay, so if my key light is 5 feet from my subject, my fill light is going to be about 1.5 times that distance from my subject. And that's just to fill in the shadows on the opposite side. Okay, backlight you use to separate your subject from the background. And this is real prevalent if you're working in the studio. It does apply if you're shooting outside. You still want to kind of position things to where light falls in a certain way, and that just takes practice to kind of get out there and really see the light. And in a basic 3-point light setup, the last one is the hair light, and that's optional. You can add that in, or you can use your backlight as a hair light, one of the two. Okay, so depending on your lighting situation, this is basic 3-point lighting. Again, once you kind of get this dialed down, then you can start experimenting with your light, and you can do some very cool things. Okay, and down the line, hopefully I can get into more creative lighting and kind of give you an idea as to how that works. Now, this shot has full lighting. So I've got a key light, I've got a fill light, and then I've got a backlight on that background. The way I've got that backlight set up, that's actually, when you see that background in real life, that background is actually gray. So what I've done was I've shot, I put a gel over the light, which gave me that red cast, and you can see a little bit falls on her hair, so it gives her some separation from that background. This one is 3/4 lighting. Okay, so what I've done here basically is I've toned down my backlight quite a bit. I've completely turned off my fill light, and I'm just using, and actually in this case I'm using my fill light as my main light. I just moved it in, and I turned off my my key light. So what was originally my fill light has now become my key light. I just moved it in, and you can see that on the left side I've got a kind of a deep shadow on her face, and that's because of the lack of the fill light on that side of her face. Using light like this is good for if you have somebody who's got a little bit of a wider face. It's good to kind of just kind of soften up some of the features of somebody's face a little bit. These shots were actually shot on film, and very little post-processing kind of went into these. But you can see again, 3/4 lighting. I'm just using one key light, no fill light, and I really toned down my backlight behind her. So the background falls almost into darkness as well. The other type of lighting is reflected lighting. Back when I was starting out and broke, I used to actually make my own reflectors. I would go to the art store and I would buy foam core. I'd go to the grocery store and buy aluminum foil. I'd wrap foam core in aluminum foil, and I had a silver reflector. Flip it over, I have a white reflector. You can get reflectors pretty reasonably priced nowadays. In this case, what I did was I used the reflector below her from where she's sitting. So basically what I'm doing is I'm bouncing the light back up into her face, and you can see it does things like highlights her eyes, brings out some of the features a little bit, keeps the shadows down like from her hair and things like that. So it pushes the light up from the bottom. Now, again, I know there's a lot of shooters out there that really like to shoot in natural light outside, not using flashes or anything. But you do kind of run into, sometimes, you do kind of run into the issue, depending on the time of day you're shooting, things like that, is going to depend on how your light's going to fall on your subject. So you might need a little bit of help. And if you enjoy shooting in natural light, a reflector is a good way to go without having to pull out flashes, and you can either fill in or enhance certain things. She had great blue eyes that I really wanted to bring out, so I used my reflector to do that. And I think the reflector that I used was probably, I think it was a 4-inch disc reflector. It's real small. So you can, or you can wrap foam core in aluminum foil. Now, just want to touch on a couple of, just real quickly, just different light modifiers that you can get if you're using studio lights. If you're, and some of these can apply to speed lights, which is just another word for a flash, an off-camera flash. But there's a lot of different modifiers that you can use. You can use soft boxes, which you see here on the right, and basically they're boxes that are enclosed. The front is translucent. Next to that is an umbrella, and it's a white umbrella. And the nice thing about the white umbrellas is you can use those in two different ways. You can see the light is pointing into the umbrella, which in a way sort of acts like the soft box. It diffuses that light, it spreads it out, and it makes it a very soft light source. Now I can turn that umbrella around and use it to bounce the light back onto the subject. Instead of shooting through it, I would just bounce the light back onto the subject. So an umbrella is kind of flexible that way. I talked about reflectors. On the right hand side, you're going to see several different reflectors. I've got a gold reflector, a white reflector, silver, translucent. Now, when it comes to the black's really not a reflector because the black absorbs light, but you can use it to flag certain things. So if you're shooting in the sunlight and the sunlight is really bright, you can use a black reflector to kind of cut that down, stop with the squinty eyes, things like that. It'll kind of help soften those things down. You can also use it above your camera to avoid any kind of light flare or lens flare, anything like that. Next to that on the left, it's another umbrella, but that umbrella is silver in the as a reflector. So you can't shoot through this umbrella like you can a translucent umbrella, but you can bounce light off of it. It widens the light source, it softens the light source, so it gives you a nice soft, kind of a bright silvery effect. Okay, the gold one, which I've used on a few different shoots, I like my gold reflector. It warms things up quite a bit. I actually used my gold reflector in a shoot that I did at an old sugar factory close to where I live, and I wanted a very warm feel from the light, so I used a flash and I bounced it into the reflector, and again the light bounces back onto my subject, and it kind of gives you a warm, a little bit more of a warm effect. There's a lot of places you can buy reflectors. I don't get paid by anybody as far as recommending places to go, but I got a real nice 5 reflector combination, which is the one you see on the left here, or I'm sorry, on the right here, with a stand, a reflector stand, so I can mount them. They're 54-inch reflectors, and I bought them through a company called Cowboy Studios. They've got really good stuff, and they've got very reasonable prices. I've been buying stuff with them for a couple years now, and I've never had a problem with anything that I've bought from them. So, free advertisement for them. Now, this one, if you're doing portrait work, or if you're thinking about getting into more fashion type work, you have what's called a beauty dish, and this is used, and you can see the comparison, the left shot to the right shot. Beauty dishes are used very close in and usually above your subject, just slightly. And basically what it does is, if you can see, there's a little dome inside the center of that of the dish, and the dish is pretty shallow. And basically what happens is your light hits that dome, bounces off, and creates a bit of a hard light. You can also put a translucent material over it to kind of soften it up a little bit. But those are fun to use. A ring flash, pretty self-explanatory. You can see it goes right over the lens of your camera, and if you look at the shot next to it, you can see the reflection of the ring in her eyes. Again, it's a good beauty shot, kind of a light modifier or flash. These can also be used for macro photography as well. And I talked a little bit about the one shot where I laid a red gel over my light to make my gray background red. So you can buy gel kits out there as well, and different colors, and you can do just a ton of different effects with those, which can get kind of fun. And this is called a grid light, and this one actually shows it on a speed light or a flash. The shot that you see here, I shot that just with a single grid on a flash sitting on a tripod a couple of feet to my right, and you can see it gives you a very focused light. And the grid light is good for a lot of these classic type shoots and classic lighting. Like if you go back and you look at 30s and 40s glamour shots, they're going to look a lot like this. They used, I'm sure, slightly different version of a grid light, but basically the concept of the grid light is to kind of get that sort of classic feel. So I have a lot of fun with that modifier. It's a lot of fun. Now, this is kind of an important thing here. One of the things that we didn't touch on too much was white balance. Your camera has a pretty good white balance, auto white balance in it. And white balance basically determines the color temperature of your photo if you're shooting indoors under incandescent lighting or fluorescent lighting, or outdoors, which the light is more blue outdoors. One of the things I suggest to you guys is to get a gray card. And again, you can get them from any camera store. And before you do a shoot, what I would do is I would shoot that gray card. You can use that as reference. When you go into, say you're using Lightroom, you can tell Lightroom, this is what, gray is a neutral color, and that's why it's best for this. But when you tell Lightroom, this is what should be gray, that will pretty much white balance all of your photos pretty consistently, or it'll give you the color temperature to balance all of your photos pretty correctly. I'll get into how that works when I do a Lightroom class, but a digital gray card is a really good thing to have, and it'll just kind of help you later on to balance out your lighting. Okay? So you guys have asked some questions along the line here. Is there any other questions you guys might have? I'm sure everybody's kind of tired. I know it's kind of went kind of long. So, and again, if you have any other questions or anything, you can drop me an email. There's my email address, and I'll leave this up for a few minutes so you guys can take a look at it. I had a little bit of issue with recording, I think. I'm going to have to go back and check some stuff. If I did, I'll probably go back and do the class just on my own, so I can get it up and posted. I don't know, my recording software crashed on me twice, but I do want to get it. I do want to get it up for you guys, hopefully within a week or so. And you can just search YouTube for illumination classes, and I actually have a test thing up there in Photoshop talking about layer masks, which I'll probably replace as well. But if you guys can go there, subscribe, you can leave comments and stuff, and things you want to learn, and I can probably do some tutorials for that. I am planning on doing some more classes, so I'll let you guys know when that happens. Got another question here. Should I still use a light when shooting outdoors, say during a cloudy day? The control freak in me says yes. um, I almost always use flash, even outdoors on a sunny day. But that's just my style of shooting. Um, Cloudy days, and you'll hear a lot of people say, "Oh, you know, I want to make sure it's all nice and sunny out there." Sun is a photographer's worst friend. Clouds are a photographer's best friend. Cloudy days take the sunlight, and clouds are the perfect diffusion material because it takes that light and it spreads it really nicely. It eliminates harsh shadows, which you'll get with sun, things like that. Um, I do shoot, and it's a practice thing, and it kind of took me a long time to get a hold of it and really be able to control my lighting when I shoot with flash outside. One of the things I do recommend if you do shoot with a flash outside is that you don't shoot it on the camera, you shoot it off camera. So you mount it onto a light stand or a tripod or whatever, and you get a wireless remote. And again, I'm going to plug Cowboy Studios again. I use one of their light triggers and two of their remotes that I bought for a really reasonable price. I think it was less than 40 bucks, 40 or 50 bucks. And those things have never failed me. But in order to be able to shoot your flash off camera, if you go with Nikon speed lights, they have triggers within them, things like that. So again, you have to kind of look at your camera manufacturer and see what they offer. But shooting with flash outside and making it still look natural is a little bit of practice. I like it because again, I can control the results. They're predictable for me, but it doesn't work for everybody. And some people are just insistent on shooting natural light. If that's the case, on a cloudy day, just know that you're probably going to be shooting at a slower shutter speed, a larger aperture, and there's a chance that you might have to bump up your ISO just a little bit. Not much. I would probably say no more than 400, but you're definitely going to have to work with your aperture and your shutter speed to compensate for that. Okay. Any other questions? Does that make sense? Well, I thank you guys for hanging in there with me. Most of you did. I had quite a few tonight. I really appreciate it. Hope to hold a lot more. And again, feel free to get a hold of me. I'm going to check this out tomorrow. I may have to re-record this and put it back up for you guys. And I think the next class I'm going to get into a little bit of, maybe a little bit of Lightroom. And then maybe sort of show you some round trip techniques into Photoshop. Now I do the majority of my work. I've been using Photoshop for 24 years, so I'm very acclimated to Photoshop and what it can do. I've been using Lightroom since it came out. I do like Lightroom, but there's a lot of stuff in Lightroom. There's a lot of stuff that you can do in Lightroom, but it's not quite as good as Photoshop when it comes to certain things. And as I go through those classes, I'll explain to you my whys. I do use Lightroom a lot, and I have been using it a lot more, but I do all my heavy lifting in Photoshop. So those are probably the next two classes I'm going to start looking at putting together. I haven't decided the frequency of the classes, so one every 2 to 3 weeks maybe. But I'll let you guys know, and I'll post it as always. So again, I'd like to thank you guys for coming in and joining, and we'll be showing you a lot more action next time as opposed to a bunch of slides, but a lot of information to get across. And it's, again, I'm kind of used to sitting in front of a bunch of people, so it's a little bit different for me too, something I got to get used to. So thank you guys very much. You guys have a good night. And again, if you need anything, feel free to get a hold of me. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.